Hey there, friends and enemies, JoPa here again, and it feels like the looter shooter genre is in a bit of a lull, which is very disappointing for someone like me who's a big fan of it overall. And while we do have games like Borderlands 4 later this year to look forward to, we got constant updates for Warframe and a new Destiny 2 DLC in the summer. I just feel like we are missing something really fresh in the genre, and that's been a bit frustrating. A lot of the developers have transitioned from the looter shooter genre to other things like extraction shooters, which is, again, very much a bummer for somebody like me. But today I want to talk about why the looter shooter genre is struggling, and it's mostly because of some of the disappointing games we've gotten in the past, and I want to talk about the 5 most disappointing in my opinion. Now, I have a couple honorable mentions that I want to start with. First off, Fallout 76. I feel like that game has done a great job of rebounding, but I don't think it ever fully recovered based on where it could have been. Fallout is such a fabled franchise, and it could have a ton of people playing, but because it had such a rocky launch and some limited features early on, it doesn't feel like it ever delivered. Tiny Tina's Wonderlands had almost the opposite problem. The launch was good, the base game was pretty solid overall, I really enjoyed my time with it, but then the end game and DLC were both extremely lackluster, and that led to ultimately me being disappointing. Both of those games, though, I would still recommend playing in 2025 if you have not already, or if you want to get caught up in Fallout 76. But it's very telling how much effort is put into both of those games ultimately, and how many people are playing today. Now, jumping into the actual 5 most disappointing looter shooters, starting with the final one, which is disappointing not because it was a full flop, but because it'll never live up to the potential that it has, and we're unlikely to see a sequel, and that's Outriders. People Can Fly was a pretty good developer overall, and unfortunately they've been hit, as we've seen in other studios across the industry, with a bunch of layoffs and a change of direction after they were given this looter shooter game to try to be their hallmark in all likelihood. And while Outriders was not a live service game, which I think is fine, we've seen games like Borderlands be successful even though they are not live service. It felt like it was kind of caught between the two worlds of not embracing the co-op shooter RPG that it could have been, versus adding a end game that was just not as fully fleshed out as players of the genre would have liked. People still play Borderlands over and over and over again, grind for rare rolls and all that kind of good stuff, and that just was never the case with Outriders, which again was disappointing because the base game I thought was pretty solid. There was a lot to like there. The abilities, the loot, there was so much there that had a lot of potential, and it really felt like as we went towards the first DLC, they were going to really be supporting this game over the long term, but unfortunately that was not the case. We got some free updates, we got the DLC, and then it kind of petered off from there. And yeah, this one, again, I think it's worth checking out if you're a fan of looter shooters even to this day, but it's still very disappointing because we're never going to see a sequel, and the original just didn't fulfill all the promises that we hoped it would have. And so because of that, that's going to be number 5 on my list. At number 4 is a game I personally did not have super high hopes for, but I know a lot of people were really excited about, especially because Arcane is a great studio, and that is going to be Redfall. Now, when I first saw this game, I was not super interested personally. It did look like a kind of game, I do like vampire-themed games, but it looked almost more like it had full horde mode with just waves of enemies rather than the depth of endgame content for looter shooters than I was looking forward to. Now, that was just my initial impression. Obviously, there was more to it once we actually got some gameplay, but ultimately this was a letdown, and they stopped updating this game far sooner than I think anybody had anticipated, and honestly it probably set that studio back a little bit. However, it does seem like they are bouncing back with some new games in the future. They didn't suffer as badly as some of the other various studios on this list, so for that reason I think it's not as bad. Plus, again, because I wasn't as hyped about this game compared to every other one on this list, my expectations were low, and so I wasn't really as disappointed. I never really had faith this would be all that great. But it's still disappointing because of the studio making it, because of the hype around it, because it was the first big Xbox-focused looter shooter. Everyone thought that there was potential this could be really, really good, and it just was never that. Moving on, though, the top 3 are some of the saddest games in history for me personally, because I enjoyed all of them, and I saw glimpses of what they could be, but they just went down a road that just was not ever going to be successful. Starting with Marvel's Avengers. And this is a game I played a ton of. I played the raid. I thought the raid was extremely well done. Of all the games on this list, it was the best piece of endgame content that we got in comparison to the other ones that we've seen that I've talked about, and the next 2 that I'll talk about as well. I felt like the characters were really well done. It just didn't have the sauce necessary. I wondered why people didn't gravitate towards this game. I understood that the whole looter shooter idea, the way that they introduced various upgrades to your characters, was a little weird. The storyline I thought was setting up an interesting direction. I did feel like there was a disconnect with having the base campaign be solo only, and then once you got to the end game you could do everything co-op. I thought that was a bit weird and felt like they should have made it co-op throughout. That would have been much more enjoyable in my opinion. It does feel like whenever a game kind of splits focus like that, it's where it really struggles, and Marvel's Avengers was definitely one of them. I thought the updates with the various characters were good. They showcased and teased a lot of interesting storylines, but it just never caught on. And a big part of that is the sauce was not there. You look at a game like Marvel Rivals and how they've developed and showcased the various characters and how just cool they look. There was not a lot there to love about the look of Marvel's Avengers. It seemed somewhat generic even for the superhero genre. And so because of that, I feel like that's the biggest place that it struggled, to be honest. If Marvel's Avengers came out and looked like Marvel Rivals, I feel like we'd be in a much different scenario. Or you look at Marvel Tocom as well. Obviously, these are very different genres, but it's just the larger-than-life feeling of a superhero game that was missing for Marvel's Avengers. And again, very disappointing for me personally, just because of how much I did enjoy my time with it. I played all of the different characters, leveled them up, I went through all the endgame content, the raid, like I said, there was a lot there. It took some time to get to where we wanted to, but I still feel like at this point, the game is fully available offline, and I do think it's worth checking out as well. The story alone, I thought, was pretty solid at the end of the day. Next, we get out into the final 2, and I'm going to start with the one that a lot of people hated. I enjoyed for what it was, but I do fully understand why it ultimately failed, and that's going to be Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. This game really set off on a bad tone right away when you had characters who are not normally wielding guns doing so. So in the comics, you won't see Captain Boomerang with all these various guns and stuff like that. And in the Suicide Squad game, that's the only way it would make sense to have it be a looter shooter. So it just didn't fit the genre. You also had a lot of characters starting out that people didn't really care about besides Harley Quinn. Deadshot maybe a little bit. King Shark was cool, but he's not like a named well-known character as much as some others. Like, we eventually got some awesome ones. We got Joker. We got some other characters that I thought were really Deathstroke. So because of that, I feel like they could have started off with some of these more interesting characters that would have gotten people more excited right from the beginning. The story, I think, really faced some problems because it wasn't the best story ever, but if you paid attention, you kind of knew where it was heading. But everyone was so upset based on how that storyline went and ended, and with the death of some iconic characters, quote unquote. I feel like that's where the narrative caught a runaway train and they couldn't rein it back in, even though it was heavily teased what the ultimate result was going to be. They also had other problems, like the end game was not good, the boss fights were not good. So those are two things that I think is a death knell to a looter shooter game. You need a solid, enjoyable, replayable end game, whatever that may be, when the game first launches, and then you can upgrade with some additional new ones over the course of time. But if you don't have that, everyone's hopping off the game right away, and then they probably aren't coming back to check it out unless you have really dope new content. They followed a seasonal model that ultimately left it lacking, and they didn't even get all of the content out that they wanted to. There was a lot of cutscenes and stuff that got scrapped, and said we got these comic slideshows, which just were not it at the end of the day, and so it ended with a whimper. And that's another studio with Rocksteady that is going to be returning to its roots, but we've seen it time and time again. We saw it with the number one game on this list. We've seen it with others like Outriders, like Avengers with Crystal Dynamics, like Redfall. Suicide Squad is another one that, if you have a studio taking on these brand new genres after getting away with what made them so great, it ultimately rarely ever works. And I think that's a major issue that these higher ups, the CEOs, need to look at. If you're going to be making a live service or looter shooter game, find people who have expertise in that genre instead of shoehorning people who are really good at what they do, and that's just not going to be live service or looter shooter games. So that's really a big problem that I think needs to be looked at in the industry, in my personal opinion. At number one, though, the most disappointing looter shooter of all time, I don't think anybody is going to be surprised by this, and it's one that is one of maybe my most disappointing game of all time, and that's Anthem. That game had so much potential. It was going to be the future of BioWare, but instead it's really led to a lot of the problems at that studio, and the game was just so much fun when you got to play it. The flying around was really well done. If that would have been a single player Iron Man game with all those abilities, with the flying, with all that, it would have been perfection. But instead, it was a looter shooter that lacked so much of what was needed. The NPCs and the storyline were pretty generic at the end of the day. There also was a lack of build diversity early on, which was a major problem. There was endgame was not fully developed when it first launched, and it seemed like they just wanted to get the game out the door and then add to that stuff over the course of time, but they just never were given that opportunity because the game struggled. Not to mention the early days were riddled with bugs and server issues and all kinds of other problems that really hindered this game. And again, when I was making builds, when I was playing, flying around, exploring the world, there was so much there. I loved this game, and the potential was just unreal. But instead of it ever living up to that, we are left with a what if. What if this game had been a banger? Would we still be playing Anthem to this day? I believe so, personally, and I think it would have supplemented Warframe and Destiny 2 in a way that no other looter shooter really has, and been like a third viable option. And that's why it's so disappointing, especially because these games take 4, 5, 6, 7 years, however long, of like many years to make. And so when one doesn't succeed, it's unlikely we'll see another one for another year or two. And so there's very limited chances of us getting great new looter shooters, and maybe going forward we won't get any that are really bangers. We do have Project LLL, we've got Borderlands 4, but aside from that, we even saw games like Outriders shift away from the looter shooter model to go towards extraction shooters. And I don't know if that's going to continue down the line, but it does seem like it's very possible. Anyway, let me know if I missed any games. What others would you put on your top 5 most disappointing looter shooters of all time? If you would change the order, let me know in the comments down below. Like the video as always, comment, subscribe, have a good one, and I'll catch you all later.